Yeah, I'm just whining and complaining. My brain is completely fried. I'm just no, you get in this no sleep zone when you have a new infant, and it's just like you're going on like 3 hours of sleep every night, and it's the kind of
See
thing
the
where you wake up and you like feel like, all right, I drank a cup of coffee, I basically feel fine. I'm just not gonna think about it. And then you like hit your knee on something and you just are overwhelmed with like rage, just to like complete, like I'm gonna literally kill someone, like you know
Yeah,
what I mean? Because it's like you're like brain is not rested, so you're just like an animal.
yeah.
I've been in this state for like a month now. Um,
That's called a amygdala hijack. When you
oh,
are
is
under a
that? Oh,
persistent state of stress
ah,
or agitation, it causes it to be kind of overactivated, and then you respond kind of hyperbolically to things like you just described. Like consistent agitation can like put it on alert,
yeah.
and apparently other things. So.
Yeah, I'm like already an angry asshole, so it's like this is just it makes me it like it's very hard for me to not like take out all my fury on like some poor like customer service person, like, but anyway, yeah. So my brain is probably not going to work super well. But last time we had chatted about the Fed, and I think the really interesting part of our podcast was the end where you were sort of red pilling me on the Fed, and so I first asked you to come and do this the week that the stock market was going to crash, which of course it didn't. Uh, like to just do another finance episode, but I went back and I listened to that episode recently again, and I wish I had like on my fingertips just the ability to sort of say what you are saying about the Fed, which I still can't do because I'll get in a conversation with somebody and I'll be like, "Yeah, the Fed's not what you think," and then they'll say how, and I'll be like so I can you like try kind of explaining this again, and then secondarily, if we have more time, I would love talking just about this beat that you and I are both sort of interested in, which is like also hard to explain, which is like global monoculture, or private equity takeover, whatever you would call that, hollowing out of everything. But let's start with the Fed.
Right. And I know it is difficult because the Fed and like a lot of economics writ large, like is you take like this precept, you take this concept, and it's just assumed to be true. That's it. Like lower rates are easy. Okay. And now we derive everything else deductively from that precept. It's pure like deductive thinking. You just take a thing and that's true because it is, because it vibes well logically. And then now your whole worldview kind of permeates from that. And the Fed stuff is very hard to refute because optically and monolithically, it's just so overwhelming. Like, no one doubts its grandeur. No one questions the Latter-day Saints of the Fed. It's like, well, of course they print money. Well, of course they control rates. It's like, well, those are intense claims. Those are very intense claims, especially the interest rate part. It's like, how do they do that? And I guess I'll just start from like the ground up and then build into why the thesis of like, a piece I just published, the Fed is a false god, and kind
Yes,
of
I saw that. Yep.
yeah, in the essence of like all this stuff where it's like you are ascribing like like USSR tier worship to like this entity that claims it's like this little deist, control of things of a complex adaptive system. It fundamentally not only can it not control, it also doesn't even understand itself. Which sounds like an intense claim because you're like, whoa, Mr. Internet guy, you understand it better than the Fed. Like, no, no, like I have humility in myself. Just because I can't tell you who controls it, like the answer is no one. It's not me. It's not me that I've outsmarted everything. It's that I also admit I can't control the weather. Even if I say this climate guy can't predict what the weather would be 2, 3 years from now. It doesn't mean, well, then who does control the weather? Nobody. Like that's the essence of this. This is a complex adaptive system output, and the Fed can at best, massage little tiny things day to day in the near term that it wants to do. And it does all this through an overnight bank lending rate, which is called the federal funds rate. Whenever the Fed announces that they're changing rates, all that means is they are changing a range for an overnight interbank lending rate.
Why do we say overnight? That was something you said in the last one. What is over that we didn't clarify? What is overnight?
So it just means like when these banks, and it's a market for bank reserves, which are not money. Bank reserves are actually an interbank settlement token. Fundamentally, they're not money that's spent in the real world. And it's overnight because typically when banks do this borrowing or need reserves for something, it's for a very short term reason. They need to facilitate like withdrawals. They need to accomplish something that's a very short term market. The repo market is for this overall. Does this too, but not for bank reserves. And it's just short term lending. And these guys are always arbitraging and moving stuff around in a way that like requires even money from day to day. So it's a very short term overnight bank lending rate is what the federal funds rate is. And what this is it's the market for bank reserves. And banks don't need reserves anymore. This is a huge backbone of my point here. Reserves do not constrain lending. They don't constrain lending anymore. You could say they kind of used to, but not really. Because, well, and I'll say why they don't constrain them now. The reserve requirements for lending for credit creation is zero in the United States. It's zero for New Zealand. It's zero for Canada. I have a list here in one of my essays, the Fed Part 1. Zero in the US. In the United Kingdom, it was zero in 1981, ever since. Australia, 1988. Canada, 1992. Denmark, 2018. Norway, Hong Kong, I'm not sure when it became zero. New Zealand, 85. Sweden, 94. And in the EU, it's 1%. So the reserve requirement against credit creation is zero across all these high economies. So that means reserves
Okay,
are
so
not.
hold on. So what we mean when we say that is we mean that if I'm a bank, I can lend you money even though I don't have any money of my own, right? That's what it means. I don't actually have to have any money stored away in order for me to lend you money. I mean, do I have to have the amount of money I'm even lending you?
No, banks literally make money out of thin air. Like that's not hyperbole. And that's when I
Well,
say
but then how
there's
does
a
the end person get any money right? How does the end user get spending power if it's not given by the bank?
So the banks are making, and they're not just printing it willy-nilly, by the way. The banks are constrained by economic motivations and by the reality of who they can lend to and the risk that they're taking when they do that. Like they're not just like, oh, money for you, right? If you go to try to get a loan from a bank, they're diving into you kind of deeply. What's your history? Are you paying this back, et cetera? So like the banks are constrained by virtue of the profitability, fundamentally, that they can make from issuing money. Now, there's a lot of information to be gleaned from that statement. That means banks only create credit if they can make a profit from it. And it's not being limited by the reserves. It's being limited by economic reality of how they can allocate those resources to make money from it. Go ahead.
So yes, I totally get it. What actually, I get a loan from a bank. They have zero reserves, but they're still actually transferring me the money of the loan, right? Or no?
They are marking up your account with numbers. That's literally what they're doing. And there's an economist, and I'm not a fan of economists in general, but
It's
Richard Warner,
amazing. Yeah,
particularly good.
it's
It
amazing.
is amazing. Like
Yeah,
this is something that people completely overlook with the power of banks.
yeah.
Banks, like he did a study on this, and this is my kind of study. Like I don't like the little fluffy economic, proving stuff with statistics, just kind of thing they do. But this guy literally went to a bank and he said, "I want a $200,000 loan." Okay, I get a loan. He's like, "Now show me your systems. I want to see your computer systems. I want to see where that came from. Did another balance go down when that went up? Like what happened?"
Yeah. That would make sense. Yes.
Exactly. That's a study to me. That's real shit. That's like
Yeah.
real science happening. Like it came from nothing. The bank
It's
literally just
literally it was just numbers. It's really amazing to think about. But so like what about this though? What if you get a loan from a bank and you are like, all right, Mr. Chase, you just gave me $100,000 loan. I want cash in another bank account. Then what happens?
good question. That's a really good question. So that gets into the mechanics of what I call reserves, an interbank settlement token.
Oh, so that brings us back to this. I get
That
it.
brings us back
Okay.
to reserves. So reserves are
Yeah,
not
yeah,
like
yeah.
literally useless. They do have a clerical function. And by that I mean when the bank makes a bank deposit, okay, the bank deposits what the bank makes, they make it based off of economic reality. That's what makes the money. Now, if someone wants to withdraw that money, say we'll do the transfer example first, and then we'll do a withdrawal for cash example. So if I got that loan from Chase, and now I was like, well, actually, I want to bank with Wells Fargo now. What would happen is now Chase needs to transfer that money to Wells Fargo. The reserves they hold act as a settlement token, a settlement balance that they transfer to Wells Fargo that represents that deposit. So via regulatory constraints, banks need the reserves for transfer purposes, for clerical purposes, and the Fed, like the government, imposes that on them. They don't really need to do that. Like all this economic activity could happen without reserves. But a law has said, no, like this is what you use for interbank settlement. This is what you need to procure to move money, or to move money bank to bank. It is a closed system within the Fed that only banks have access to it, and some other small examples that aren't worth going into, but like it's banks. Banks have access to these things that they move just for settlement purposes. But the reserves were not the impetus for that bank deposit being made in the first place. That was made out of economic reality and a motivation the bank had to lend that. Reserves are purely for clerical purposes. So that's so to facilitate that, I'll stop
so it's
there.
all made up. It's all made up. Like all the money is fake. All the money you have in your bank account is not in any real sense way at all tied to a bunch of money sitting anywhere. It's just a number in a system. That's all that it is.
People struggle with like the realness of money if it's not tethered to like something concrete or that's constrained beyond man's ability to manipulate it. For example, gold, right? If you tether it to gold, we can't just from an atoms-based standpoint make more of it. So we feel comfortable that the money's real now because there are gold rocks backing it. And I say gold rocks a little like, pejoratively, because it's like, why is this like why is that?
That's right.
Exactly. So we're getting out
Because
to
it
like
gets you pussy, because you can trade gold for pussy, and it's the easiest one-to-one thing. No, yeah, sorry,
so
keep
I
going.
would say what actually backs this though, and what is very credible is violence. And I mean that literally because the
No,
state of
sure.
tax liability.
Yeah,
And when a
right.
tax liability is literally a forced bid, you need my dollars. If you don't get them, bad things happen to you. This goes back to like ancient times, even, or like not ancient, like older times, where like even in colonial days, they would impose taxes on people there. Like, hey, you need to go do work in the fields to get the currency to pay me the currency. Well, I don't want your fucking currency. What are you going to do? I'll burn your hut down if you don't give me the currency at the end of the day. So go work. And if you don't tithe to me, I burn your house down. It's the same thing, but a little more civilized today, where work, and if you don't tithe to me, I put you in a box. I incarcerate you.
I would bet that 95% of the people in the world think that their bank account in whatever build, they truly imagine that there is cash dollar money somewhere in that bank that is their money. I think they really think that. I think most, if you went to just ask a person on the street, where is your money? They'll be like, oh, it's in a vault in Chase. Like, I really think that they think that. I don't think that they realize that it's just the only thing keeping their money is a mark on a ledger that Chase Bank keeps
That's
effectively.
exactly
That's
correct. It's
all that it is.
blockchain
Yeah.
systems are the same as
Yeah.
all this shit. It's ledgers. So to get bring back to the question you were asking on transferring out. So that's how they would move it interbank. They need the reserves just for settlement interbank for clerical reasons. They can go borrow that in the reserve market. They can go get it and means from each other. It
Well,
has
but
some.
what
I'm
is
not
the
saying
what
it's
is
not, but it's not guiding the reason they make these
yeah.
economic loans.
I get what you're saying. So when you're saying that it's a reserve settlement, what you're saying is at the end of the month or whatever, Wells Fargo and Chase say, oh, well, this many people took money from me to you. This other amount of people took money from you to me. And let's settle it. Is that kind of what you mean?
Basically, but these happen, I believe, intraday, by end of
Yeah,
day.
every day.
So,
Okay, so every day they do this. Okay,
yeah.
yeah. So they set what did you call it again? It's called the settling. What did you say? The
Reserves, I call it an interbank lending token. And there are a couple other
interbank
guys,
lending token, but you also said it was like the function was for something.
clerical reasons, like operational reasons, really.
No,
Like it's and
no, something you just said, but anyway, I'm sure you'll say it again. So what does the Fed then have to do with that? Oh, overnight, this is what you're saying, overnight, with that daily relationship between Wells Fargo and Chase, that they're reconciling these books every night. What does the Fed have to do with that?
so kind of tying back into the setting the overnight lending rate.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that they do. And from that, you think the cost of money, cost of information for an entire $27 trillion economy has been changed. Now, I'll tell you where that assumption comes from. Again, this is another one of the economic deductive things that economists, which is just basically motivated reasoning because it makes the models work. This is why they think that controls the rest of rates. If you control the first rate, all the other rates are a cascading result of that rate. And I'll quote like Greenspan directly in a conversation with Congress. He described something of a conundrum. He's like, well, if a 1 year bond, a 10-year bond is simply a series of 1 year forward rates on the 1 year bond. We can control the 1 year bond pretty well because the overnight rate controls the nearer term stuff. So he's like, then that's the academic logic. If you control that rate, then the other rate follows suit of that rate, and the other rate follows suit of that rate through this, again, theory selling. Like it's just a theory. And the conundrum that he's stating is like, but the longer bonds don't seem to be listening to us. The actual interest rates, like the stuff that people are using as benchmarks for credit creation and as risk-free rates, they're not listening to us. This is a conundrum. Like this is an actual statement that he made. And that's the essence of this entire thing. Like I'm not being reductionist. The entire presupposition that the Fed controls rates is because they control that one overnight rate. And it has influence on shorter term bonds, meaning like 2 years and under. Because they can roughly massage those in the near term, that means they can change everything else purely through a concept called term premiums, which is another way to say basically what I just said. That control one, control the other, and the premiums represent the time that it must be held. So a 10-year loan is riskier than a 1 year loan, right? So the rate should be higher. Like it vibes logically, right? It's a logical kind of thing to assume. It just doesn't work that way. The yield curve doesn't operate that way. It's been heavily inverted for the last couple of years. It just uninverted recently, but it spits in the face of all of this. And once you distill down to kind of like where this all comes from, then you look at like, well, what does inform rates, right? The first question is like, well, who does control rates? My answer is nobody. Like I don't need to give an answer to that. I just am saying these guys don't. And what does inform rates, and I've done this in the Fed Part 4 and other series since, where if you take the growth of a nation plus its inflation, you add those two things together, it tracks rates very closely. And tying back into the statement I made previously, I actually don't know if I made it yet, where banks lend money based off the profitability they can find from economic reality. They're basically sellers of money. That's what banks do. They sell you money. So if they can sell money for a higher rate, 5, 6, 7%, that means there must be someone, if I'm going to take a loan for 7%, that means I can invest it for like an 8, 9, 10% return, right? Otherwise, why would I borrow at 7? That means there's economic productivity happening. That means there's economic opportunities. If a 10% loan I can take out and make money with that, that means shit is growing. That means there's something active going on, right? That's why people take loans out. That's why banks change the price of money that they charge for people, which is what an interest rate is. It's the price of money. So what the Fed does manipulates one thing for clerical reasons on how money gets moved around on the back end that they force on the banks. But the banks are generating this money purely off of economic reality, which is, again, the output of a complex adaptive system based off of inflation and growth, which is nothing that no one controls with buttons.
Got it. Yeah, no, I'm following. I follow the whole system. The only thing that I don't totally get is the overnight lending rate. Again, just to return, let's imagine that the Fed is not saying, I'm giving Wells Fargo this type of loan, I'm giving Chase this type of loan. What the Fed is saying is, hey, you two, Wells Fargo and Chase, tonight when you reconcile your books, if Chase owes Wells Fargo at the end of that, they owe X percentage interest on that differential. Is that right?
They don't owe any money. So if Wells Fargo already has the reserves to send to Chase, they just send them. Banks tend to keep as much as they need for day-to-day activity. There's some regulatory impositions on that called uh, capital adequacy ratios constrain lending, and the LCR, liquidity coverage ratio, constrains that liquidity need. But if they have a reserve shortcoming to fulfill that, then they can go into the reserve market and borrow some and then transfer it. So there is some instances where they need it clerically to smooth that money if they didn't already have the reserves. And that's where changing that reserve rate can have some influence. Like, it's not completely meaningless. It is just sort of a triviality as it relates to how loans are made in real life and what is causing the banks to create this credit. And a credit-based economy is how you have growth. Like, that's how this is all fueled. And to act like this one little institution, because of a clerical thing it does on one rate, massages all this or controls it, is just, it's patently
Yeah.
nonsense. It's like a communist tier fantasy that everyone takes at face value.
So, I totally get it. And it makes, and I like what you've said about the real closer understanding of what a rate really looks like is inflation plus growth. But what I still don't get is the rate itself, the Fed interest rate itself. What is this a rate on? Where is the transfer of funds going that can be charged that rate on it?
So if I need to borrow reserves in the market,
So reserves are something that only the Federal Reserve can offer, can have?
yes. So yes,
Okay.
reserve. So the reserve backing, that clerical baseline, does come from the Fed. Okay,
Okay.
that does come
So
from the Fed buying
a
reserves, and
a reserve is something only the Fed can issue. What is a reserve? It's just a, yeah.
that's because there's a two-tier money system happening here, right? So you have the bank deposits, and the bank
Yeah.
deposits are what the bank creates when it wants to make money that lets you do things you want to do, to invest, etc. That's the economically productive money. This is money that consumes resources. Okay, this
Yeah.
can consume resources. Now we have reserves. Reserves, if I move this money somewhere else, I need an amount of reserves commensurate to move with it. Okay, so I would need to borrow reserves to move this money if I didn't already have it. Okay. Now I want to invert this
Got it.
though.
Got it. Okay.
If I had 20 trillion reserves and I had like no bank deposits, doesn't fucking matter. These can't consume resources. These can't do anything without the bank deposits on top of them being made to spend in reality. This is just fluff bullshit that the Fed prints when it does QE stuff. And everyone looks at an M2 chart and says, wow, look at all the money in the world. This is like taking $50 trillion and burying it 300 feet below ground. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't consume resources. The bank deposits do. And the deposits only get issued when the bank decides, hey, I want to make a loan. Bank deposit, bank deposit, bank deposit. I make these things, I make these loans of my own volition. And for clerical reasons, I do need reserves for transferring them if I want to move them around, or if they want to, leave the bank.
So the Federal Reserve gives out these reserves that you can never spend.
That is only useful for banks settling money between themselves.
Between each other. Yes. So they exist under the ground and they can only be spent to reconcile stuff. You can't take any money out of the reserves and give it as a loan ever. That's completely your job as a bank is to never do that. So
banks do not lend out reserves. They don't lend out reserves.
Yeah. So say that you have 3 million in reserves and then 3 million in flying around money on this second level. Does that bank, is that money in terms of like actual money? Does that bank have $6 million or $3 million? Or does that question not make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, I mean, how much money does the bank have? The bank has, the reserves can be seen as like liquidity for the bank to fulfill clerical purposes. So if there was a run on the bank, like that would come out of the reserves.
That would turn into real money. If the bank really went to horribly, the reserves would turn into real money.
I want to emphasize though that that money already exists in the run on the bank scenario, because remember, I gave it to the bank.
Yeah.
And now they have my money and they're just giving it back to me. So the reserves aren't like new money in that example. It's not like printing something that wasn't already there. The banks make the original thing. And then the reserves, just again, for legal reasons, are needed to like clerically fulfill this stuff.
So is a reserve somehow indicated as a reserve? Like, is a reserve dollar literally different than a non-reserve dollar? Like, no, right? It's just, It's just the way that this stuff is considered, basically, right?
I mean, it's not part of the capital adequacy ratios, and capital adequacy ratios are what actually constrain spending.
Yeah.
So meaning like bank's capital, it's part of the Basel III regulation. So tier one and tier two capital, which is basically equity, and common preferred shares, retained earnings of the bank is basically it. That constrains the actual bank's lending activity, its ability to create risk, to create money that consumes resources in the real world. Reserves are not considered part of that. They don't constrain you in that way. Borrowing in the overnight reserve market would not help your capital adequacy ratio, because when you borrow, if I borrow $1 million, I have $1 million in an asset, but then I have $1 million in a debit too. So I don't have more capital. It nets out that way. So you can't like borrow your way in the reserve market to higher capital to lend more. It has meaning for, again, like bank runs, liquidity for like withdrawals, stuff like that. But that's money that was already there. To give an example, the BTFP program when Silicon Valley Bank ate shit, right?
Yeah.
To give some credit here, like what the Fed did was, again, this isn't like money printing in any serious sense. What they did was a factoring loan. A factoring loan is when I let you borrow against an accounts receivable, against money I know that's coming in the future. And I, a bank, let you borrow against that because I know that's coming in the future. When you have bonds, the banks own a lot of bonds. They own a lot of treasuries. That money is coming back to them eventually, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years. It's an accounts receivable. The money is there, but the bond mark to market price is lower. So what the Fed did is said, okay, the mark to market of that bond is 70 cents on the dollar. I'll let you take a loan at $1 on a dollar against that bond so you can fulfill the withdrawals and all this shit. But all the withdrawals and all that shit was money that was already there. Like those deposits didn't come, like those came from people giving money to Silicon Bank and then Silicon Valley Bank saying, oops, like lost them, right? Like that's not new capital, so to speak. Now the Fed can avert like deflationary catastrophes, which I would say it definitely did there. Because if it didn't backstop that and said, fuck off, you guys are on your own, you would have had a big issue in the banking system probably. So that they provided that backstop by letting you borrow against your bonds was helpful. The banks had to repay that loan within a year, though, by the way. Like it's not permanent. And they had to pay interest on it too, by the way. So like the banks got a loan from the Fed from their debt. They had to pay interest on it, and then they paid it back. So it's like, and everyone freaks out like, oh, they're flooding the market with liquidity. Like, no, they gave access to money that was already given to the bank. Interest rate movements fucked around with the bond price. So the Fed gave a factoring loan against it. There was a loan that was paid back. So it's like, this is not very sexy stuff, right? This is actually kind of boring, whatever clerical things on the back end, but we dress it up as this like, oh my God, like God decided to do something today and they're changing how the whole world works. It's like, no, like this is not, you're ascribing deity like powers to an institution clerically relevant at best.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. They're just kind of managing the relationship between the banks, more or less, kind
Yeah,
of. And
yeah.
the people are acting like they're in total control of the economy.
Exactly. And part of the
Yeah.
reason why they focus now on rates, and this goes back to like the lore of Volcker, which I cited recently in a post of mine. They used to focus on the amount of money in the system. It's like, well, if we can change, the amount of reserves in the system, then we change economic activity. This was like the Fed's guiding light for quite a while. But then they figured out that the Eurodollar market exists. And the Eurodollar market is deposits and money held outside of the US banking system, outside of the US purview of US regulators. That means it's not subject to reserve requirements, not subject to like certain things that the Fed can control and impose. And what these guys do is the banks move the money offshore. Then it doesn't have these rules and restrictions that they have when it's onshore. And then this money can like proliferate incredibly so. Like it's rumored that there might be as many as 20 to 30 claims on the same dollar in the Eurodollar market, meaning it's rehypothecated 20 to 30 times. So like no one a physical currency.
That's amazing.
They have a ledger system of
Yeah.
claim on a currency.
That's so funny,
And
dude.
the Fed finally figured that out. And like in the Volcker time in the 80s, like, fuck us, we can't control any of this stuff. Like they'll admit it if you read the transcripts. And Volcker's like, hey, what about rates? How about we focus on this? Like we can control the overnight rate. We can sell this academic theory here. Let's just like the rate is what we do now, right? We can do that. We have no idea what's going on with the money supply. Greenspan will admit this. Vernacular, like they'll admit this. So like we don't even know how to measure money. Like we genuinely don't. These are quotes from these guys.
Yeah.
And so they focus on the rate because they have no fucking idea what's going on in the banking system and derivatives and Eurodollar markets at all. It is
Wow.
extremely opaque and it is insane how much exists beyond the purview of them. There's a whole other world out there that's of dollars that the Fed and regulators have no control over whatsoever. The
That's so
gold
funny.
standard ended well before 1971.
Yeah. So, does anybody in the Fed rate itself, do those reserves that are shifting back and forth between the banks, did they technically owe the Fed back that's those reserves?
It depends on how they got them. So, for example, when QE happens, right? The thing everyone like all QE is, I'm a bank and I have assets of bonds in reserves and cash and whatever. The Fed says, hey, I'm going to swap you cash for that bond. So I had $1 million in bonds. Now I have $1 million in reserves. Okay. It's a 1-to-1 asset swap. The bank has no more assets after any of the shit the Fed does. It's just playing games with the balance sheet composition. So in QE, where the Fed says, "Hey, give us your bonds," and the primary dealers collect the bonds and they have to sell them to the Fed, that's you could call that reserves the bank doesn't have to pay back. It's reserves that the bank can lend out and try to do something with. It can earn interest on them at the Fed. So those would be reserves that it can keep. Whereas if the bank has a reserve shortfall and needs to facilitate some wires and transfers, it would need to go borrow that. So that would be an example of reserves that they would need to roll over or possibly repay. So it depends on how they got them.
Hmm. Well, it's definitely very interesting, man. It's really you have a quest against the Fed, or at least not against the Fed, but just of people giving the Fed too much power, basically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. My motivation here is like, one, it doesn't do anything anyway. Like it's optical nonsense. So it's like that won't change whether or not I say the things I say. But ultimately, what bothers me the most and is my motivation here is guys like you and like guys in the crypto and DeFi industry and people I work around, like just sycophantically just worshiping, like, oh, you know, talking about them. It's just so agitating to see this like worship of a government institution from
Yeah,
guys that are
yeah,
like fuck the government, they're liars, they do all this thing. But like, no, here, no, they're definitely mad. They have all the power they say they do. No one questions them. It's like you have this carve out that you don't understand that you have. You have
yeah,
this like exception you make for a standard of evidence that you apply to everything else, but not the Fed. You just take it at face value, and that's what really pisses me off and like motivates everything.
yeah, yeah, totally. All right, well, let's talk about this other thing a little bit. So, you and I have frequently talked about, it's part of the reason why this is so nefarious is there's no name for it. And I was just talking to somebody else about this, but this process in which global capital, if for lack of a better word, enters local places and it displaces the local resources, whether it's meat or a bar or a housing or whatever these things are, it displaces them with this sort of faux local thing that is actually a hollowed out version that feeds back its resources to some centralized place. And
Trader Joe.
yeah, Trader Joe's, right. I've noticed that every time I post about this process, including that article, there's going to be a war in Montana, people go nuts. People love talking about this. And not only on the right, like kind of both sides just cannot get enough of this topic. So, and you in particular have been very encouraging on this and you seem to really get it. And every time I see you tweeting about this, I'm like, oh yeah, we are right on the same page about this stuff. So how would you, what word do we use to even describe this process?
So like private equity sneaking in and putting up a facade of locality, of parochial like appeal to like extract like to do their globalism better.
Yeah,
Um
right. Yeah. What do we call this?
globalism,
Globalism.
like some kind of like not parochial globalism. That they gotta be shorter and sweeter. I don't know, like something that conveys like warm, fuzzy apple pie, but is like secretly like this I
Yeah,
forget the
like
word.
lizard. It's like a lizard pie, but it looks like apple
Yeah.
pie.
Cosmopolitan pie. I don't know, like
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah,
bakers there underneath.
yeah,
But yeah, it's very common, and you've been highlighting it really interestingly because like it's one of those things I'm aware of, but not like super focused on, and it's much more common than you realize once you start looking for it. There's a phenomenon for that too. Once you notice something, like once you notice it all the time, and it's more
yeah.
common than you. I forget what that's called. Um, but yeah, something like that would I think be a good summarization that would make people start to notice like the very cookie cutter off the shelf hotel, like restaurants. What else is it really common with that? Restaurants.
I think anything that is really local. So, like, I think it's kind of the same process as single family homes, right? I mean, like Blackstone buying all the single family homes is kind of a version of this in a way, right? It's like they're going to these touch points that are almost nobody thought they could ever be subject to a global market. And now suddenly they are. I mean, to me, the clearest example is meat. I had that post the other day, and it's like I take this meat out from Whole Foods and it smells terrible. And I look at it and it says from Uruguay or Australia on the package. And it's like, what? Like, first of all, I'm in California. There are plenty of cows. Like we don't need to be getting our meat from Uruguay or Australia. And it's like, there's something really, really weird and bizarre and gross about, and like anti-human about getting your meat flown to you from, how
Yeah,
could it, think about how bad it must be if
yeah,
it was cheaper to fly it all the way across the world to you than
yeah.
simply just get it next door. Like it must be such bad quality.
Like to highlight this, a comment that kind of reminds me of to like show like the strengths and drawbacks of being a reserve currency and like of globalism in general. Like being reserve currency status has provided us immense privilege by way of like being able to spend, even though we can spend kind of whatever we want. We don't need to issue bonds for that, but we do. But like there's like an endless sinkhole of demand for U.S. dollars, domestically and abroad. A lot of it abroad. A lot of debt is issued in dollars abroad that lets us have this huge deficit to kind of like finance our largesse and our empire. That makes the dollar stronger than it should be. That lets us spend a little more, frivolously and more, more aggressively than we otherwise could. That strength that gives in the dollar hurts our domestic industries because now our exports are not as competitive. Now Detroit cannot sell its goods as competitively as say Japan because our currency is comparatively stronger because there is such a demand for the dollar because it's this Schelling point currency that all these nations that issue debt around and have demand for use. They use it to settle oil, to buy oil. They use it for everything they do abroad. I think like 70 or 80% of the world's transactions happen in dollars. It's some insane figure. So like that allows us to finance largesse that amplifies power loss, that amplifies the US strength, but it guts the middle. It kills the fucking middle. It
Mm.
kills the industry domestically. It kills our exporting abilities because now that currency is stronger than it should be. And now, again, we're less competitive in the world. So now we have to outsource this shit because it's cheaper to do so because there's nothing more valuable. There's no higher order value than cheaper trinkets. So you get them from elsewhere because that's more competitive to do so. So it's like this beautiful, poetic kind of oxymoron of a privilege that it lets you do these things on one end, but it kills you in another that eventually brings back some equilibrium.
So why does it hurt? You'll have to excuse me for not having a financial brain. Why does our um, currency sort of punching above its weight class hurt our ability to manufacture stuff, good stuff?
So it behooves the currency of a country to have a weaker currency because it makes their exports more competitive. And it's because if I'm buying China's or Japan's cars, okay, Japan sells their cars in yen. So that means I need to get yen to buy those cars. So if $1 buys 10 yen and that car is at $10,000, okay. Now if if the yen gets weaker and $1 is worth 20 yen, well, now I can get to that 10,000 yen figure easier. Now I can buy, now your exports are more appealing to me, right? So I can sell my exports more readily, the cheaper my currency is.
Got it. Got it.
So
Got it.
that's why, generally speaking, a lot of export-led countries like their currencies weaker. Germany
Yeah.
Germany massively benefits from the eurozone thing because their currency, if they had a currency, if they had the Reichsmark still, should be much stronger than it is. But because they share this currency with like weaklings like Greece or Italy or whatever, these countries that
Wow.
they benefit because it's like you get like this socialized kind of strength of it, and Germany disproportionately benefits by selling its exports.
That's
Um,
really fascinating. So it's like Germany. Yeah, we all know, just for the listener, that I think, if you look at these numbers, it's like Germany is the only exporter in Europe or something. It's like, they actually are the only ones that actually export more than they import. Like, I think it's like literally, it's just Germany. And so, everybody always talks about how Germany is getting screwed by the EU. But in fact, the fact that Germany has to bail out the Greeks all the time actually helps Germany maybe in some ways, because it makes their exports cheaper for people buying them, and therefore much more appealing.
And I'd also recommend too, like there's more than one currency goes beyond that of just a bank credit. Currency is also power and control. And Germany exerts, I mean, if you look at EU leadership, I don't love it. I've looked at it closely, but I've been told many times it's a lot, very heavily German influenced. They get that power because they are the finance engine. People know where their leverage exists. And the Germans know they have it by virtue of like, hey, we're the powerhouse here. We're the ones who actually export. So they benefit from having a weaker currency than they otherwise would because of the eurozone, and they also get to control a great deal of how that thing works because of their heft and what they can do economically. So yeah, the Germans probably benefit economically in a lot of ways and in control ways, much more than meets the eye.
That's so interesting. Wow. So, right. So, okay. So it makes it, what you're saying when you say it hollows out the middle, is it makes it harder for American manufacturing because it can't compete on the global stage because the currency is too strong. Um, so how are you seeing that with regard to what we were just talking about, though? Like, what's the relation between that and this sort of
Right.
globalist hollowing out? Yeah.
Right, because you're the point you made that kind of catalyzed all that, where you're like, how ridiculous is it that
Yeah.
like it makes
Oh, yeah.
more
Right.
sense to go to Uruguay for meat than here? Now it's like I don't know the
Yes.
economics of domestic meat production, but it's like there is some kind of margin happening
Some
where it does
currency.
right, like
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
all
Yeah. Yeah.
it's probably derived from some sort of perversion that seems ridiculous on its face, but is probably a cascading like third or fourth order effect of the reserve currency example I just told you. Like elaborated. I'm sure it has some kind of cascading effect there. We can't quite point to, but because this is a complex adaptive system, we don't know right where it all happens. But it's I don't know how something like that comes to exist because it is ridiculous on its face.
You're just saying that there's some currency blip that makes it cheaper. There's some glitch somewhere that makes it cheaper to do this. Is that what you're saying? Because of the currency differences, or what? How does it root back to the Fed?
So it doesn't actually root back to the Fed so much.
No,
The
no,
Fed
not the
has
Fed. To root back to the thing that you were just saying. Like
so
you said it
just
all comes back to, yeah.
Yeah. So like going back to like the car manufacturing example, we can see in a very clear first order effect how the currency is stronger than it would be because of the reserve status and the selling point. It hurts domestic manufacturing. You hollow out the local the manufacturing of your thing. You hollow out the middle. You get a further amplification of power loss, like more
I
rich,
see.
more.
Yes, got it. Sorry.
So I imagine this also applies even to more microcosm scenarios, like I don't know, agriculture, meat. I don't know those economics, but I can imagine that again, like these farmers are very middle class people. This does have a hollow the middle class out effect to it. I imagine somewhere in that supply chain, you're getting kind of that weak dollar, that strong dollar makes sense to do it here, then bring it over sort of thing. Because
Right.
buying fish Uruguay is actually more, and shipping it here is more economically logical than actually just growing them here domestically. I'm sure there's some sort of impact from the reserve currency status and what the U.S. is or largely makes that happen.
I mean, it's so crazy, right? It's so crazy to think I mean, also maybe it makes sense even on a global systemic level, right? I mean, it's like if you were to run the globe as a single system,
Hmm.
you probably would say, even if you were to run it maximally efficient, say you were to run the globe with maximum efficiency,
Mhm.
maybe you would grow all the meat in one place and not another, right? I mean, as long as you don't care about the quality at all, and everything in life has been bled down to its, most basic, like, like just been bled out of anything that's like good. If you're gonna be distributing global meat blocks, probably like the meat comes from like one place, right? I mean, it's
Right.
like you know.
I mean, if you like what globalism does, is the essay I wrote called "Mid-Range Jumpers for the Middle Class" kind of
Oh
sums
yeah.
this up.
Yeah, yeah,
It
yeah. Right, right,
creates
right.
grayness, and it creates
Great
grayness because it
title.
actually
Great title.
stifles like the variability. It paradoxically, it kind of crushes diversity, but in all the ways that are invigorating to man, because like a nation and its people like often derives its personality, its purpose from like the people they're building and creating shit. But if everything is an economic calculation where everything is an expected value and okay, let's this a division of labor calculation fundamentally, but writ large for the world, not in a company like nations. Germany just makes cars, Uruguay just makes fucking fish, whatever. It's like that is so like degrading to the human spirit and like to the domestic populations where it's like you're just a GDP output for just this one thing, no creativity, no variability. It maximizes everything into like an expected value calculation that creates these like hyper concentrated sectors and regions, and you only do this because that's the only place where you have an advantage. So it's great for like again Excel spreadsheet visibility of the world,
Yes,
but
exactly.
those
Yeah,
things
right.
fundamentals.
Well, and I'm imagining you're calling it that is it because of that chart that came out about the NBA shots?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I should give a background on that. Yeah, there's a chart that shows right in the NBA right now, like almost all of the shots are either three pointers or like layups, like in the mid range, like in the close range zone. I forget them, like in the paint. So NBA players have figured out like the most highest expected value, basically, because the 3 point is disproportionately valuable. It's probably too valuable. Seth Curry kind of exposed that. So like they're all shooting threes or they're all shooting layups. And so there's no more mid-range jumpers anymore. Like if you look at the shot chart, there's almost no mid-range. So that's where the name mid-range jumpers for the middle class comes from, because like this concept applies to sports and like the Moneyball concept, where it's like you're just looking at expected value of things. You care nothing about any razzle dazzle the player might have, any like whatever. It's just, do you do this one thing really well? Okay, let's do it. And that's all that you do because statistically it makes the most sense to do it, but it creates greatness and it creates no
Yeah,
mid-range.
right. It creates a horrible environment which is it's so funny. I was already kind of hating on the NBA before that because I grew up with Michael Jordan, man. Like should love basketball. I do love, I loved it then, but I've turned on a couple games recently. I'm like, this sucks. I'm like, it's just such a bad sport because, like you're saying, people are, Steph Curry runs down the court, shoots 3-pointer number 7,000 for the game, then runs back down the court, then they shoot a 3-pointer. And it's like all the magic of Jordan was all in that mid range. That was what made Jordan great, was dancing around in that mid range. That was the whole point. And that was what made basketball really, really appealing. Whereas now, right, it's just giant guy down low, little guy outside, fling it, fling it, fling it. And then there's 55 replays now. And then we have to watch the replay. And then we have to get the fouls. And I was just like, this sport sucks. Like, this is not a good sport. Like, it doesn't work. All these statistics and technology have basically killed basketball. So it's the
Yeah,
perfect metaphor. And it is really funny how just all of society is like filled with these metaphors of the middle being hollowed out.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's funny, like the middle is like it's a linchpin for like what we're seeing now with like this kind of degrading of the spirit, because the majority exists in the middle. The majority derive, there's the middle where, and those are the people who need purpose and a sense of spirit. And the globalist Moneyball, like Moneyball is like globalism for sports, kind of almost in a way.
Right, 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 right.
Really extreme expected value view of behaviors that creates this grayness, that's this uninspired, like you just described. There's no Jordan anymore. It's like all Curry or it's all Shaq, like
Yes.
no variability. Um,
It's like, why? But is there any defense for this? Because this is what I think. I think in their minds, like they are, you know, uh in the like world of the people who are doing this, right? I met a guy the other day at a party, and he was this you know, really smart, very bright, you know, like a guy like you, basically, you know, like really, really bright. And you could just immediately tell this fucking guy knows what he's talking about. Like he was a finance guy, worked at some big index fund, um, or yeah, I think it was an index fund, and not Vanguard or BlackRock, but like one of the other ones. And he, you know, we start talking, and then of course politics comes up, and immediately he just takes this jackknife turn into pure globalism and into saying, oh no, we don't, immigration, like immigration's great. We need growth. We're the only country that's growing. You know, it's like, why would we not want this? This is great for us. Like every other country's dying. We should be happy that we're growing. We need the replacement force, you know, like blah, blah, blah. He has all these reasons, these like really well thought out reasons why, uh, you know, we should have 10 million, you know, people
Right.
from Haiti flooding into the country. And if I say anything like,
One's
um,
cheap. By the way. That's only just
wait,
cheap.
what?
Cheap.
It's cheap labor. When that cheap labor is good, right? It's like you want that, right?
Yeah,
Is
I
yeah.
mean, you do. But I call it what it is. Like, you're not like, you don't love immigrants. You want fucking cheap labor to keep the cost of production down because it maximizes your returns, because it's economically profitable for you to do so. Like, the degree that you think that's a purely unalloyed noble, like noble cause, is like the degree of like, I mean, just how obsessed you are with an Excel sheet being able to tell you how the world is working. Like, I think the nature of like someone like that who only sees existence through the lens of like GDP growth and you must be expanding, otherwise you're stagnating or regressing, is like someone who completely overlooks like how purpose is derived for people, and how
Yeah.
like how color and variance is something that we actually cherish and need to continue to like get a sense of relevance to us. It's someone who tries to like distill down the human spirit to like an entry point, and then just plugs them into to a sheet. And it's like, well, clearly this is good because it creates more money, so it creates more technology. So that's just always good. Like, it's
Yes.
not always good. That's definitely good. I'm just saying, like, all of life is a trade-off, and you are trading something off when you maximize for that. And if you maximize for that too much, you're going to get these massive division of labor style hollowing out of middle class things, and you will eventually have a price to pay, because humans are not something you can just distill down to like three motivations and then there you go, they'll behave
Well, and
now.
it's kind of utilitarianism, right? It's as James Poulos tweeted the other day, or said the other day. Somebody said like John Stuart Mill is really the the Hitler. We should all hate John Stuart Mill. Because you know utilitarianism is kind of where this all comes from. It's like the idea that yeah, humans are fungible, and as long as we're like giving them enough protein points, that's happiness, you know, like
Right.
that equals happiness. And it's actually, that is the actual literal reverse of the truth. Like the truth is the total opposite. The truth is that reducing things to utility points is what makes people unhappy, and what makes people happy is everything that's the opposite of that. I would say, you know, in a way. And, you know, and that's true until you're dying, you know, until you're literally starving to death. And then, yeah, sure, all you care about is your meat brick, right? But it's like people don't live that. That's not how people live. We
Maslow's
don't,
like, you
yeah,
need that, you need other fucking things too, right?
yeah.
It's like I would tie this in and like not to, the word communist and the word fascist is thrown around like so cavalierly, it doesn't mean anything anymore. But like a core precept of communism is it is that power laws aren't real. Everyone has innately the same abilities. So if there's a distribution that corrupts that or disproves that, that means someone's being extracted from someone else. It doesn't understand human variability, because it's a deeply religious belief that it's like humans are like this. They are blank slates. They don't have these biologically instantiated sort of ways that they have, weaknesses and abilities and what have you. So if there's a corruption of this, something happened, we need to fix that. We need to rectify the victims of power laws. And I'd say a lot of people too now with this unbridled immigration, what's like, what's the difference between a Haitian and a German? They're the same fucking thing. It's the same concept where it's like,
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, right. And this is where racism comes in. It's like,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
it's
where
like,
that's
yeah,
where like race communism, which is
yeah,
kind of a correct categorization. You think there is no difference
yeah,
across any people. So ergo, based off that precept, which is a very religious concept, again, economically, you're thinking deductively. I have this belief. Why do I have it? I just do. And now I'm going to derive my whole worldview based off this religious presupposition.
yeah. It's
Um,
amazing. It's amazing how like this conversation is just like all these things are so much more interconnected than you think. It's like all this stuff is connected into this same thing. And it's like this thing is just this global Leviathan, and it's a mentality, it's a religion, and it's like, and it's just like this thing that's happening to the world. And everything is this single thing that we're talking about right now. And
yeah,
it's like, why is this happening? And again, who knows? Like, what if in the end, and look, I don't, of course, I'm dedicating my life to standing against this thing. But imagine, like, what if this thing is actually just destiny? Like, what if human beings are just meant to become this like hive, this like global hive of like perfect distribution of resources from to everybody, exactly the right amount. I mean, it sounds like literal hell, right? But it's like, maybe that's what humans actually want it. Like, maybe that's what we are. Maybe we're just like bugs, like.
I think if anything, well, AI plays a very, very large role in if that will happen or not. I don't think it will fundamentally happen because man has not evolved over thousands and however long we've been around to be that way. It'll take a very, very long time to transmute like those impulses and urges in the human nature, which communists and the left and all these things fundamentally have policies designed as if they don't exist. That you did a great essay recently on like why communists lose, using an example of like an extremely extravagant grocery store that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah. Error. Oh yeah.
That's because it's appealing to a human universal, this trait that seeks out status, that wants differentiation, that wants to
Yes. Yes.
to display something that's worth displaying. Mankind will always do that, and that will always subvert these fundamentally like communist gray goo tendencies that try to force or bolt on this religious presupposition of no human variability, no human power laws. This is how we think it should be. I mean, it's the most like malevolent form, I think, of religion that exists, bar none. It just doesn't point to anything in the sky, so we don't think of it as a religion. But it has every bit of the same like supernatural presuppositions about how people ought to be, how things ought to be, not how they are. So because it stands in completely in opposition of natural law, I don't think it'll win because that would mean to defeat nature. And if you're going to defeat nature, maybe a pattern god like AI can do that. Maybe I have very like you
Pattern
know
God. It's a good name.
I have a
Pattern
very
God.
yeah
That's what
like
we
I
call it.
that's what I think it is. I think fundamentally
Ooh, I like it.
I absolutely think AGI will exist in a very, very strong fashion. Um, do you want to go down this path, or I don't?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, let's go. We got 25 minutes, so we got to go somewhere. So yeah, let's go.
I mean, this is my series of thinking on AGI and why I don't think it is constrained by its data set. I think that's a very. Like, I'm not an AI I'm not a machine learning mathematician or anything like that. So just to qualify, you're listening to a guy who is obviously curious and looks into things, but I don't have a technical backing here. But I will give you the observations that tend me to come to this. Neural networks, we call them neural networks because they're designed literally after the human brain. Like we patterned how we process information and drive things and then put that into a machine to learn what machine learning is. They use neural nets. Okay, so we're using a pattern matching system fundamentally the same as us. Now, I've used ChatGPT and all these LLMs fairly extensively. And knowing how they come to their information, and I see how good they are with them being still kind of retarded in the grand scheme of things of what to become. Then I look at myself and I look at how I'm talking to you right now. I'm on like autopilot right now. I'm like not even, I'm just speaking as I have something to express and it's coming out. What I'm doing right now is a form of sequence generation. What I'm doing right now is I'm drawing from patterns I have experienced and seen in the past, information I have absorbed, things I have been exposed to. And I'm drawing a sequence generation to give you this output, to describe to you the patterns I have seen. That is exactly what an LLM does when you give it a prompt. You say da 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 da, and it gives you an output with certain temperature and whatever settings, consistent with the pattern of words you just fed it, and it gives it its pattern of words, and vice da da da. So what this tells me is that all intelligence, and I've thought this well before LLMs, that all intelligence is pattern matching. It just depends on the degree of what kind of patterns you're matching, and if they're obviously patterns or not obvious ones. So, for example, a test is obvious pattern matching. You are looking at a question, you are thinking back to the pattern you were told was correct. This is the right answer. Okay, this is the answer here. Very clear pattern match. Whereas something like what I'm telling you, where I abstract mid-range jumpers to globalist policy, right? That sounds like a leap, but you can see how I'm matching those patterns to come to that conclusion, right? It actually is a pattern insofar as the behaviors it's forcing and the results it's creating manifesting in different domains. Now, no one that doesn't. What data set did I get that from? Right? Did someone? No one told me that. By the way, that's my own creation. A lot of my stuff is. So it's like, where did I get this from? I sometimes don't even know. Like people will like, I'll get questions sometimes like, where did that come from? Like, I'm not sure. I'm really not. And when you ask ML scientists, like, how did the AI do that? How does it know what race someone is from their X-rays, from a pixelated X-ray, no less? Like, how the fuck does it know that? If you ask any doctor or anyone alive, could the AI do that before it did it? They say, no, of course not. Like, race is a social construct, whatever. Like, you can't figure out someone's race from a skeleton. You can. You like the AI can do it from X-rays. Was that in its? How was that in its data set? Besides the fact that it saw patterns writ large, so many that it fucking figured it out. And
Okay, sorry, we lost power here in Pasadena because it's 110 degrees outside. Um, and yes, so we lost power. I'm hoping that we have the other part of this recording from Zoom. We'll see how buttoned up Zoom is. Um, but yeah, I'm surprised. We never lose power in Pasadena, but here we just did. It's because it's so hot.
Oh, some
Um,
South Africa energy, huh? Keeping the generators going.
yeah. Anyway, so where were we?
So I was discussing like how I infer um, pattern matching and how AGI will absolutely exist and it will not be constrained by a data set. Using an example of myself figuring something out or drawing a pattern without a data set, it really fundamentally draws down to the fact that I very strongly believe there are a finite set of patterns to observe in the world. And that sounds like maybe a ridiculous thing on its face for the same reason there's like an infinite number of moves to do and go, like the Chinese game. But it's like the same way I abstracted like two things that seemed unrelated, like mid-range jumper NBA behavior and globalism and middle class and the dollar, and compare to those things are the same. Like the pattern that created both of those things is the same pattern. Now it just manifests differently. An AI seeing enough of these things writ large will not need to see exactly the new, novel thing it hasn't seen yet because it will be able to pattern match that behavior based off an insane amount of patterns it's seen in the past. And no, this is the same thing. I can figure out exactly what this is from seeing the fact these behaviors and these sets all correlate. Ergo, this is this with 99 point whatever cent thing. I know what's going to happen. So that's what I mean when I say there's a finite amount of patterns. There's a finite amount of like sequences and behaviors that humans and even like probably nature and the climate can exhibit after a certain extent. And if you feed enough of those to the machine, it'll be able to see what the next one will probably be. So I don't think it'll be constrained by its data set because I think that's a very like myopic way to understand what patterns are and to view them as these very specific things. It's the kind of person who would think, well, this is a brand new thing. It's like, no, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Like, where does that come from? That means that it doesn't need to be the exact same thing. Like, it can be a different name, it can be a different reason, but it's the same pattern. And that's why it rhymes. So fundamentally, that's that concept abstracted to AI. Thus, I think AGI absolutely exists.
So you don't think that there's some element that it won't be able? You don't think there's some truth that you think that all intelligence is 100% mixing and matching, and there's no divine spark that is like something that comes from nowhere that lights all these patterns on fire in a way, and it takes you somewhere genuinely new, blah blah blah.
Like insofar as like what creates like human spirit and what creates like a soul. Like I'm not touching that. I'm touching like the way you and I are able to figure things out, the way anyone is able
Yeah.
to figure, the way someone comes to new information, the way Nikola Tesla figures shit out. Like it wasn't in his data set. Like he got there because he had a unique gift to extrapolate patterns. Jim Simmons, he'll say that he says the same thing, like in quotes. He's like, I didn't have a particularly gifted math ability. I just knew where to look. And that, when I hear that, that tells me. And another guy I worked with, Bob Mercer, was like, if it made sense where we looked, people would have already looked. So that says to me, we saw patterns that no one else sees in other
Wait,
spaces.
who is that you're talking about?
I'm sorry, Jim Simmons is the founder of Renaissance Technologies, which is the most successful hedge fund in history. Like 60% average returns for like forever. Like they basically figured out the market. Like it's Jim Simmons, like in what he's done. It's an algorithmic hedge fund. It's not like a Warren Buffett style fundamentals investment. It's correlations. And Bob Mercer was someone who founded it with him. So these are guys that like figured something out on a deep, deep level by looking in places no one else initially wanted to look. And it wasn't like a math thing. It was like a something's there thing. Like I'm seeing a correlation or a pattern that someone else isn't seeing. Look what I just found. Like you can just look at human history and how we've figured things out or invented stuff and how it's been novel or new. But really, it's fundamentally predicated on extrapolating a pattern that you've seen. I think the AI does the same thing. So that's how I think where intelligence comes from. Like the soul, the spirit, like what gives you the zest for life, what makes us want to like seek struggle and purpose. That's a different comment. I don't know if the AI will have that, but I do think the AI will have as much of a perfect intelligence as you could hope, because I think it will have all of these patterns with perfect recall. And whatever an 1,000 IQ AI looks like, I don't know. But it will be based off of everything it's seen and knowing I've seen all this and I'm going to see it again. And I know how it's going to look when I see it again. And that's that, history doesn't repeat the lines.
So why doesn't everybody just use Renaissance Technologies? Like if it's that good?
So it's the Medallion Fund that has this broke the market like algorithm. It's capped at $10 billion. Because basically, there's a book on this, and I haven't read it by a Wall Street Journal writer. It's capped at 10 billion because if they do more than that, there's not enough liquidity for the stuff that they do. Apparently, like it becomes like at a certain point, too much size actually inhibits your ability to do things. So it can only get so big. So as it gets above 10 billion, they return capital. But it is basically a money printing machine at that size for what they have cracked. Yeah, everyone doesn't go to it because not everyone can. In fact, right now at this point, I believe Medallion is only for employees of Renaissance. Those are the only people who can access it because it's the hottest commodity in the world because, of course, everyone wants access to this thing. It has insane fees because it can. I think it has like 20% of the assets and like 40% carry or something of the returns. But yeah, you can only get to it if you're actually an employee of Medallion at this point or of Renaissance.
Well, so what if you can only do it as an employee? What's the point? I mean, like, why if they're not selling it to people? What's the point?
And making a shit ton of money for themselves. It's a closed hedge fund. It's like a private. It's like a private office kind of thing where only a certain amount of people can invest. And if you are so lucky to get in there, hey, like you're set for life. You literally create something that prints money for you. So it's a closed prosperity kind of thing, I guess.
That's cool. And this is who, Mercer?
Robert Mercer. Bob, yeah, he's that was the CEO of Renaissance up until recently.
But this isn't Bob Mercer. Isn't Bob Mercer like a Republican?
Yeah,
like,
that's the same guy.
That's him? That's him.
The same guy. Yep.
Oh, really?
Backer of Breitbart, yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's the same dude who made this fund?
Yeah, he is next level capable, yeah.
How long has he had this?
I think him and Simmons were like two of the original founders. They were co-CEOs for a while. And then Mercer stepped down because of like, Breitbart and whatever, and people freaking out about that. But he still works on the fund as a researcher, but I don't think he's leadership anymore. And Simmons died this year. Yeah, it's funny. Simmons is actually much more of a Democratic supporter too. So they're very opposite spectrums politically.
Interesting. So, all right. So last question, and then I should go anyway because my wife's calling me, and who knows where the power is out here or not. But Um, so with AI though, why then, if it's gonna get all these patterns down so well, it seems like the one thing it can't do, and this was my skepticism about it, it seems like it can't actually do the 20% of human work, or maybe 10% of human work needed to go beyond the level of basically generation loss, right? It's like it can't really do concrete things, right? It can't concrete, it can like almost do stuff, but it can't finish a job. You know what I'm saying? You
Like in the
can't
physical world?
in anything, you can't get your AI to finish your job. You can get it to like assist you to a certain degree, but you can't
Mm,
get it to like go all the way. I mean, unless you're doing
mm,
something very, very silly, like making a, thumbnail for a podcast, which is what I do. You know what for all my podcasts,
right, right.
I put a bunch of, I use the blend function, and I just put a bunch of pictures like associated with my guest in there and just see what it
Mm.
blends. But and
I know what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's fun. But like in terms of an actual task, it can't actually cite your law review article for you. It can't
Yeah,
actually
yeah, yeah.
do that. Like it can kind of come close, but it. So like, what do you think about that? Like this is related to the hallucination problem, right? It's like it can't actually for sure tell you this is correct, right?
Yeah, yeah. So like that judging AI now is kind of like judging like crypto now or DeFi currently, like or like judging the internet in the 90s and being like,
Yeah,
this
this is
thing
what
will
it's
one
going
day
to
let
do.
you this thing will one day let you stream videos into your house and let you do virtual reality. If you looked at like the internet in the 90s, you're like, fucking, I have to lock that. I can't even have my phone. This thing is slow. It's a porn
Yeah,
and an email machine. What are you
yeah,
talking about, man? Right? So it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
definitely
yeah.
not ready for prime time yet.
Okay,
Like
yeah,
you're
that's fair.
still it's still being fed like information and growth that it needs to do to get there. Like, because I've used AI agents before. Yeah, they're not that good. You do need to fact check them on stuff. Like, it's definitely not where it will eventually be. I'm extrapolating in my own pattern matching, looking at what it can do now in a very nascent way. Like ChatGPT came out like 2 fucking years ago, not even
Yeah,
2 years ago. I think it was November 2022, and it's
yeah,
like, look where we're at now, where it's like it's already like we're coding full things with I forget, there's just something came out that like codes websites immediately, like the music, the art, like it's already advanced rapidly within like 2 years. And I know it's like there's going to be diminishing returns at a certain point, but it's like that. I just see as we continue refining these models and feeding it this information, you need to feed it. You'll get, I think, to where we'll be eventually. But yeah, now is not, yeah, it can, it's certainly not there yet. But I analogize that to the internet.
Hmm. Well, that's really a whole other conversation. I'm still a skeptic, I have to say. I mean, I definitely am fascinated by this algorithmic calculus that, as you say, nobody can tell you how the AI knows how to do these things, right? And that's
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
really fascinating to me, because there is some equation, but the equation is just so vastly complex that humans can't even conceive. And I think that that's
yeah,
very cool. And that's what that does, what make me like bullish on it.
right.
But I also kind of tend to think that it's like your computer analogy is a good one, but also computers also aren't really like, computers are great, but have they actually made my life any more efficient? Like, no, not really. I have
They've
to,
made you more productive. They made you more productive, but that doesn't mean you're happier
kind
for it,
of.
right? Like that's a different question. Like, well, imagine if you lived in like the 1800s. What would
Yeah.
your day look like? Like you'd wake up, making food is like you can't just order it in from Starbucks. You have to make it. If you need to do laundry, your wife needs to spend half the day doing whatever to fucking clean it. If
Yeah.
you need to
Yeah.
write or do work, you need to write it with a pen and then hand deliver it to somebody or
Yeah.
maybe on a horse. Like so, everything you do is just slower. So
It's slower.
when economists say productivity, like that's basically what they mean. Whereas now when you have a computer, wham, bam, bam, food given to me, press a button on the machine, it cleans my laundry for me. Like now I have all this more either free time or time I can focus on working even more. Like, well, what do you do with that?
Yeah,
So
that is true to a degree, but it's also like I have friends in cybersecurity, and it's like the new problem is not that there's like unknown stuff. The problem is that there's way too much known stuff. You know what I mean? It's like the computers also have amplified complexity to a degree that is it can ultimately hurt in some ways as well, right? It's like you know what I hate the most in the world is like the apps, the endless numbers of apps I now need for things. You know what I mean? And it's like that doesn't make my life more efficient. It makes my life way less efficient. You know, like
yeah.
so I don't know. I mean,
As with any tool, it depends on how you use it. So like I don't think necessarily the existence of this will necessarily make the human condition better. Like I don't think it makes you happier. It's just like, you know, this. Yeah. Well, why does tech make anyone use it or like it? Does it provide you like a personal satisfaction? Does it make a chaotic life less chaotic?
No,
depends on who you are. Depends on how you use it.
Yeah. True. It's not. Then I do understand what you're saying. It's not a life makes. It's not a makes your life better machine.
Yeah, it's not utopia. Not utopia at all.
Yeah. Okay, dude. Thank you so much. Things are getting weird in my building. I don't know what's going on. I think people are like eating each other. Somebody just like ran by singing. There's no power. So I should get out of here. But thanks so much, man. And like, yes, fingers crossed. I think hopefully when I turn this thing back on, Zoom will be smart enough to have saved it. But I guess we'll see what happens. And yeah, dude, fascinating conversation as always. Thank you so much. I really love talking about this stuff. Oh, and dude, here, I'm just going to stop the recording. Tell people where to find you.
Oh, yeah. So you can find me on Twitter, Back to Bunny. You can find me on Substack under the same handle. Twitter is usually where I'm most active, but I'm being more active on Substack lately just because less slop there and better for long form epic posters. So, you know.
Totally, man. All right.